live, so we can
Excellent.
be live. So if you turn off your video, it won't transmit to Facebook. So try to stay on video.
Yes.
And if you don't want to be on the Facebook Live, then you can keep the video off. I'll be in the background, and hopefully you won't need my help, but if so, please do let me know. Thank you again, Professor Laine. Looking forward to this.
Yes.
And we will be making the video available after as well. I think we are live currently, Timothy.
Okay.
So if you want to take it over.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Thank you, Ahmed, for getting things started. And I wanted to thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Timothy Welbeck. I am the Civil Rights Attorney for the Philadelphia Chapter of CARE. I'm pleased to join you tonight by my esteemed colleague, Evan Laine, who is a professor of, he is an associate professor of history and law at Jefferson, at Thomas Jefferson University. He's also, he's a man of many hats, actually. He also is the faculty director of the Arlen Specter Center at Thomas Jefferson University, in addition to being the director of the Law and Society program at Thomas Jefferson University. So he is, in addition to that, he's also a practicing attorney as well. And so he is well versed in the topics that we will be discussing today. He has taught about the Electoral College and lectured about it. And so he is well prepared and capable of being able to answer some of our questions. And that's what brings us here tonight. And that the United States has a unusual form of selecting its chief executive, and the way in which the Electoral College functions as the mechanism to select who will become president of the United States. And for the last 2.5 decades, for the most part, that has mainly been an inconsequential matter that plays out after the general election, at least before the eyes of the public. But we now are facing an unprecedented means in which to circumvent the Electoral College process, or to abuse the Electoral College process, I think is a better way to frame it, in order to impact or change the results of the general election. And so imagine that our community had many questions, because the general public has many questions about what is happening right now, and how does the Electoral College work? Why is there still, are there still seeming questions about the outcome of the general election that is now more than 2 weeks past? And so our hope is to answer some of those questions tonight, tell you about the potential that is happening right now between the president's ongoing litigation in states like this one, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Nevada, and the overall plot that the president's legal advisor, Rudy Giuliani, has mentioned in public recently. And we'll also discuss what it is we can expect or anticipate from all of these things as well. So that's what we intended to speak about tonight. It's an important topic. Grateful to be joined by Professor Laine. Like I said, he's an esteemed colleague and well-versed in our topic for this evening. And so with that said, Professor Laine, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Professor Welbeck, and thank you for inviting me to this. I think it's a really important thing to learn, because as a professor of constitutional law, which I held that position at Jefferson before Professor Welbeck succeeded me, because I now teach conspiracy theories, I noticed that the students really had no understanding at all what the Electoral College was. And then when I branched out to give similar talks like this, I then saw it wasn't just the students who didn't understand, but many adults didn't. So what I did is I created a presentation, which I'm going to give to you, which I've updated several ways, thanks to the new election. But what I'm going to talk about is what it is, first of all. And then when we get past that, why it was created. And then once we get past that, we get into the chaos scenarios, I call it, that we're all concerned about right now. So right now, what I'm going to do is share my screen and go to my presentation.
Absolutely.
Okay. Sam, is it available? Is the
yes,
technology's working? Okay, that's always, it's always a good thing. Okay.
Always wonderful when the technology works.
Yes. The Electoral College is the number 270, is a magic number. And only one person can get that because it's put that no one could, you can't get two people at 270. So when you meet 270, you are the president of the United States. So I like to look at the 2016 election because that is a good example of how the Electoral College played in. If you see, obviously, remember, it was Trump versus Hillary. And if you look at the popular vote over there, she won by almost 3 million votes. So you would say, based upon the way we understand our system, she won. But of course, we all know she did not. So he's the winner, as we can see, because he won the electoral vote. He achieved 304 votes and she achieved 227. So that was the end of it. He's over 270, he's the president, although she won the popular vote. So how the heck did this happen? So that's what I'm going to explain, and that is the differential there. This is the fourth time in 58 years that presidential elections were won by the Electoral College and not the national vote. And by the way, this is something that has been occurring a lot recently, because if we go back to the 2000 election, Gore versus Bush, Gore won the popular election, but lost because of Florida. And that's another lecture altogether that we could talk about another time. But anyway, so how is the number of votes from each state determined? And this is critical, okay? Number one, every state has 2 senators, every state. So that's the number we start with, 2 senators. And I just want to aside for a second, because I have an audience, so it gives me an opportunity that I don't want to let go. I'm just going to move my screen down so I can look at it. Okay. Every state has 2 senators. That means the Senate has also unequal representation. And it's the Senate that selects Supreme Court justices. So when votes are made, Dakota, South Dakota, they have 4 votes. New York and California, they have 4 votes. The difference in population is undescribable, but yet both states have the same power. California and North Dakota have the same power to pick who sits on our Supreme Court. So that's just an aside for a second. So we start with 2. Everyone starts with 2. The next thing we go to is how many congressmen people do we have? So every state has at least 1. If you have 2 people living in that state, you still have 1 congressman. So we start with a minimum of 3 votes, 2 senators, 1 congressman. And that number is increased. The last time this was looked at before the latest census is for every 700,000 people in your state, you get another congressman. So that if you have, say, 1.4 million, you've got 2 congressmen, and so on and so on. So the more population you have, the more congressmen you have, and thus the more electoral votes. So putting it simply, if you have 3 congressmen, you're going to have 5 electoral votes. That is 2 senators, 3 congressmen. So it's a pretty easy thing how to look at it. And that is a map as of fairly recent with each state with as many electoral votes as you can see. California has 55. That means they have 2 senators, because everyone has 2 senators, and they have 53 congressmen. If we look at this area here, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, they all just have 1 congressman and 2 senators. And if you go across the map, that's the way it works. That's how the numbers are decided. Here's the problem, okay? I do a deep dive on the numbers. California has, when I did this, and I'm sure numbers have changed a little, 39 million people is the population. US population when I did this was 323 million people. That's 12% of our population. But they have 55 electoral votes, which is only 10% of the total, actually less than 10% of the total electoral votes available of 538. So what this means is California is underrepresented in picking the president in the United States by 2%. And when we have these close elections as we have, 2% is big. Now let's look at Wyoming. okay? Wyoming has less than the number for more than one congressman. They have 580,000, which equals 0.18 of the population. But since they have 3 votes, 2 senators, 1 congressman, they have 0.56 or 0.6 of the electoral vote, which gives them 3 times the impact on the election than they deserve, according to their population. Texas is another one that's underrepresented. They're 8% of the US population, but only 7% of the electoral vote. So they are underrepresented by 1% in picking the president of the United States. Looking at putting the small states, as we call them, together. We put the 3 staters, the 3 voters, Wyoming, Vermont, Alaska, North Dakota. That's 12 electoral votes, 4 times 3, easy math. And that's 2.7 million people there altogether. Percentage of the US population, not even 1%. Percentage of the electoral vote, 2.2. That gives them a 1.41 advantage of more than they deserve by population. Again, in a close vote, Wyoming, Vermont, Alaska, and North Dakota have tremendous power when you think about it. Looking again at the big states, okay? California, Texas, Florida, New York. They have 108 million plus. They have 151 votes. Look at this disparity. US population, 33%. Percentage of the Electoral College, 28%. That's 5% disadvantage to these big states. So as you can see, the big states are being discriminated against the smaller states. Now, if we're going to talk about race later on, but big states happen to be populated more by minority members than North Dakota and Alaska and so forth. And if you want to look at that, it's a taking away of power of minorities as well. Big cities are usually in big states, and big cities happen to be more diverse. So that's another way we're going to look at this. Just one more time, looking at these numbers, when we put California, New York, and Texas together, they have 26% of the population, but yet 23% of the electoral vote. We're putting Wyoming, Vermont, and North Dakota, they're the least populated states in America, okay? They have 0.6% of our population, but 1.67 of the Electoral College. So I think I'm making my point here, looking at these numbers, that the big states have a lot of electoral votes, but in relation to their population, they have a disparity. The small states have a plus, even though they have very few people living there. Wyoming has 500,000 people, yet they have 3 electoral votes. So it's winner take all. Now, I want to explain what that means. Gore versus Bush was a big case back in 2000, and that's, again, a subject of another lecture. But the court made it very clear that voting is a state issue, and it always has been. Even when you're voting for president, the states make their own laws, they control their own elections. That's the way it works. So the way it usually is that if you win, say X state has 1 million people in it, and 500,001 person vote for candidate X, 499,999 vote for candidate Y. All that state's electors, all those numbers go to the winner. It's winner take all. And it's an odd situation if you think about it. But say, let's take the same state. Say 999,999 vote for candidate X and 1 votes for candidate Y. X still, of course, wins the state, but 499,000 people in that state really don't have a voice, because it's the same thing if you win by 1 as you win by almost 500,000. And that also affects seriously New York and California, which happen to be heavily Democratic states, and the Democrats win big in those states. but it really doesn't matter if they win by 1 vote or win by 10 million, because it's still the same thing. It's winner take all. But 2 states have proportional voting, which go by the percentage. If you have 10 electoral votes and 60% went for one candidate, you get 6 votes for that candidate. That's only 2 states. So now we have a mix-up going on, which is not good. We also have a situation where electors, now we're going to talk about this later, say you're picked as the Democratic, the way it works is the Democratic Party picks its electors in New York, and the Republican picks its electors in New York, using that as an example. And if the Democrat wins, those people vote. Republican, those people vote their electoral votes. And usually it's all of them. But say one guy wants to change his mind, or he was paid off, or he's a faker or a liar, or whatever it is, and he wants to throw his vote to the other side, he can do that. And here's the fun part. It's against the law, and they can go to jail. But here's the fun part. His vote still counts for the other side. So this system is really messed up beyond. We're not even to the worst part yet. So does anyone have questions on the numbers before we get into, are there any questions on the numbers before we get into the whys this exists? Okay, I was so good at explaining. I'm very happy with it.
You did do an excellent job at explaining that. I appreciate that clarity, because something that often comes up during these conversations is how these smaller states have a disproportionate impact in the outcome, as opposed to if we did just a popular vote and contrast. And so I think what you just illustrated was very good, in that state like North Dakota, if you live in North Dakota or South Dakota, or you live in Montana, have a disproportionate impact on the vote than if you live in New York or California, Texas, Florida, or even Pennsylvania or Ohio.
It's absolutely true. So now we get into the why, and the why is not nice. Okay, we're going to get into that first. Our founding fathers had a very low opinion of the voting public, and found that we can trust them maybe on local elections, but on important elections such as the presidency, they're just too stupid to pick someone. We cannot trust them. And back then, it was obviously just white men who were voting. And that was the extent of it. But they're quite vocal in the founding fathers about not trusting the general public to vote directly. So they figured if the general public voted for electors, if something really weird happened or whatever, that more intelligent minds would prevail. This is what Hamilton said, the great play Hamilton on Broadway. A small number of persons selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass will be most likely to process the information and discernment requisite to such complicated investigations. Basically, the public is a bunch of idiots, and we need electors. And you know what? We're really not geniuses, and we're still stupid as a country. 40% believe that chemicals are deliberately spliced by jet planes into the atmosphere. They're called chemtrails in order to influence our behavior. A third of Texas believes that humans and dinosaurs roamed the earth at the same time. Gallup poll revealed that people believe the earth is the center. 18% believe the earth is the center of the universe. 25% believe the Constitution established Christianity as a national religion. No, 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 and no. Okay, we're a secular nation. Autism remains a top worry, with 20% of respondents believing that vaccines cause them, although there's no scientific evidence. And some people believe vaccines and diabetes is related. To give you an idea how US scores on everything, very low. You can see, where's the US in here? We're nowhere near the top.
I don't even see the US, yeah.
Where are we on science? God, I think Slovenia, and no disrespect to Slovenia, but I don't think they have the same university systems we have. Where are we in math? All right, and reading, Wow, we don't even make it. Okay. Wait, here we are, 25, 40, and 25. So I just put that there as that maybe the founding fathers weren't so off on that one. But anyway, this is the more troubling part of it. The founding fathers, and this is an argument that we have a lot in class, a discussion we have a lot in class. In order to form, as they say, a more perfect union, the South would not agree with the Northern states to form this union during the Constitutional Convention unless they allowed slaves. And that was the deal that was made. Now, the Southerners were afraid that because there was more people in the North, that they would be outvoted on issues, and eventually slavery would be taken away from them. So the only way they would agree to be part of this union is if slaves were counted in the electoral process as far as population goes. The slaves were made 3/5 a human being. When you're counting for each congressman and get whatever the number was back then, you would count the slaves, but only as 3/5 of a human being. And that's one of the greatest stains, as far as I'm concerned, on the Constitution, because legally saying a Black person is not a human being is so atrocious and has led to such horrible sequela after that. But that was done. You can see why Alabama would want that. 900,000 people lived in Alabama at the time, but you had 400,000 slaves. So if you count the slaves, you get 2 or 3 more electoral votes. With Georgia, you can see half the population. Mississippi, more than half the population was slaves. So with that, they wanted to be represented beyond what they should be represented. Tim, I think we're having a little feedback on your side. You cut the mic.
Okay.
Thanks. So as you look at Mississippi, they wanted slaves to count, but the slaves didn't get 3/5 of a vote either. They had no voting rights at all. So this was the Southern states said, all right, we'll be part of this deal. We'll be part of this more perfect union. But we're afraid you're going to take slavery away from us because there's more people in the North. So the only way we're going to do this is if you count the slaves, we get the electoral votes, but of course we don't say slaves are humans, and everyone's happy, and thus we form the more perfect union. That's why the Electoral College was selected. It was a way of appeasing the slave states in their fear to lose it. This is Madison, who was the architect of the Constitution. And this is what he said: the right of suffrage, which is voting, was much more diffusive in the northern than the southern states. And the latter could have no influence in the election on the score of Negroes. In other words, in a direct election system, the North would outnumber the South, whose many slaves, more than 500,000 in all in most of the states, of course, could not vote. But the Electoral College was set up to give those southern states a power that they needed in their minds to keep their slavery going. And by the way, regarding the Constitution, people always say the Constitution is about liberty and pursuit of happiness and all that. That's not in the Constitution. The Constitution is a lot about setting up government, and it's a lot about slavery. It's a lot about this. It's a lot about what happens when a slave leaves and how they're brought back, and how slavery will be continued for, I believe it was another 20 years. Tim, is that, was it 20 years? Yeah, another 20 years. So that's what the Constitution talks about. Am I right, Tim?
Yes, I had to unmute myself. Yes, but the Constitution allows for the continuation of slavery 20 years after its ratification for the active slave trade. But a thing that was unique to slavery in the Western world was that the slave population grew rapidly, in part the enslaved population grew rapidly in part because they were bred like animals, and so in the process of doing that, when slaves are procreating, you get more enslaved people, and so even though the active slave trade ceased, meaning that ships had to stop coming from Africa to the United States, the enslaved population was still growing. And just by way of example, within that 20-year period, the enslaved population in South Carolina was actually larger than the general population. And so this is one of the few places in the history of the world where an enslaved population grew naturally over time. It was in part because of that process.
And looking at the 20-year thing, it has nothing to do with morality. It has everything to do with capitalism, supply and demand, because slaves, as Tim said, and as we see, 3/5 a human being, were looked at like livestock. And if you cut off the supply from overseas, your livestock increases in value, and you control supply and demand. So that whole 20-year thing wasn't out of the goodness of anyone's heart, but rather to keep prices up on the value of owned human beings. And interestingly enough, it worked, because for 32 of the Constitution's 36 first years, a white slaveholding Virginian occupied the office of presidency. So their plan worked. They kept the power. Even though they didn't have the population, they kept the power through the electoral system, through what we just saw. And it worked out. Good idea, James Madison. Jefferson, who our school is named after, and that's a subject of another time, another seminar. But he won the election against John Adams in a race where slavery was a decisive margin of victory. It was the slave states that brought him over because of the Electoral College. Adams, for all his foibles, Adams was a strong abolitionist and did not believe in slavery, but he lost. Also, so why did the North agree to this? There's a couple of reasons. Everyone was making money. The North, you've heard of the triangle trade, I'm sure. People were making money. The cotton provided 50% of U.S. export earnings. People always wonder why the U.S. did so well at the beginning, because we had cheap labor. That always works. It wasn't even cheap, it's free labor. So you're seeing it is a big money maker. Slavery paid for a substantial share of the capital and the goods that were made, and how this country was born. We were able to sell our goods cheaper on the market. We made money, and that's how the United States was born. So why did the North agree to it? Money. There's also threats from abroad. You had Napoleon, you had European threats, and having a United States and a united army was also something of interest to the North. So that is also there, but money is always a substantial factor in these things. Taxes came in, and more importantly, the South, as I said, we're going to walk out. They would not, and we would not have a union. And I've had students say, maybe that should have been a good thing. Maybe at that point, the North should have said no. And the great injustice of slavery would not have stayed in the northern states. That's something, that's altering history and knowing what happens, but it always makes for an interesting argument on whether or not the North did what was morally and ethically right when they agreed to this. So why does it remain? So does anyone have any questions on why it was formed? Tim, any questions? I'm just amazing here.
I mean, you are doing a good job in explaining it. And regrettably, the answer to most questions as to why something happened in American history goes back to the legacy of slavery. And Americans bristle at that idea. Senator Tom Cotton just yesterday was lamenting the 1619 Project on the Senate floor because it's challenging what he believes to be a conventional understanding of history. But as Nicole Hannah-Jones has said many times, if 1776 matters, if 1789 matters, so does 1619. And so this legacy right here is an important one to reckon with, because at the time of the enshrining of our founding documents, we were not a democracy. We weren't even a democratic republic. You could own half the population of the people here, just about. And another half of the population could not vote, could not own property, could not divorce their spouses, could not hold elected office. So when you look at the disenfranchisement of women, of Black people and Indigenous people, that's a legacy that we need to reckon with, especially because what you mentioned at the beginning, how there is a current attempt to disenfranchise these same groups of people now. We're trying to change the outcome of the election.
How interesting that the senator's name is Tom Cotton. I always found that funny in a sense. And just a quick comment, because I have the floor, I can say what I want. I truly love the country I live in. And I do consider myself a patriot. I hate to use the word because it's been misappropriated. But I also believe that whoever you love, you should know the truth about them. Because not everyone, even the people we love dearest, have faults, and we have faults. And when we understand our faults, that's the only time you could actually make it better. Because you always want to make the one you love better. And not facing who we are, and then we can never make things better. And something like not supporting that, not looking at the actual truth. And by the way, Tim, I think we're letting it off light, calling it cattle, because ranchers treat their cattle well. They usually don't beat them to death. So, as they did with slaves. So I think that's lower than cattle, as how slaves were treated. But anyway, we have a question. Go ahead, Tim. You want to take a look at them?
Yeah, we do have a question from JB Home. If you could type your question in the chat section, I'll ask it to Professor Laine for you.
Okay, I'll go on as you get the questions, and interrupt me, Tim, when you're ready. Okay. Okay. Inertia is a big reason. You know, it's hard to get stuff done. Constitutional amendment is hard to pass. We couldn't even pass the Equal Rights Amendment for women. Never mind changing this. This is the process that you may not know, okay? You need a 2/3 vote in Congress, each house, Senate and the Congress. Then it has to go to the states, and you need 3/4 of the states to agree. That's a lot of work. I mean, we can't even agree on whether COVID exists right now, okay? Never mind on something like this. So it's a really difficult thing. You could also have a convention, a constitutional convention, and it could come from that, but they need 2/3, and again, 3/4. So this is really hard to do. So why don't we change it? Because it's hard. And we have a situation of big states, this guy here, versus little states. The little states like the Dakotas and all those people feel, well, the only reason people care about us in a presidential primary or a presidential race is because we have these 3 votes that we could put together in a block because we have similar interests in the Midwest. And instead of being 3, we're 12. And even though that's amazingly disproportionate, as I showed, then they pay attention to us. Then we could get what we want. And that's why they will never, ever agree to get rid of this system, because it gives them an advantage over the big states, which they feel railroad them into doing things they don't want to do. But then again, if we have a majority that wants something, it shouldn't go that way. But the other side will say, we don't want the majority to railroad the minority. So the smaller states will never agree. And of course, we have this situation now, which really prevents cooperation of any kind.
Absolutely. And we just got our question. I believe it's actually from Jacob. His question is, did the abolitionists focus on the Electoral College?
I don't think so, from what I remember. I think that was one step down the road. That was just fighting to get rid of slavery was enough for them at the time. I don't think people like Franklin, who was an abolitionist later, I don't know how strong he was during the Constitutional Convention, but I think at that point they were looking at the agreement more than anything else. Any other questions, Tim?
Yes, we have another question too. Why don't the rest of the 48 states also allocate electoral votes proportionally like those 2 states?
Great question, and they can. Okay, there's actually a consortium that's being put together by a number of states, I think New Jersey and New York are one of them, to agree to do proportional voting. But until they have a significant amount for it to happen, because why would they do it in New York? It actually work against them to do it unless there's a wider agreement. Each state has the ability. Remember I said at the beginning, voting is controlled by the state, even in federal elections. Each state, if it wanted to do this, could do it, but will not do it unless they have a significant number of the smallest states agree. Otherwise, they're working against themselves. Because New York would then lose more votes.
Absolutely.
Okay, so moving on, unless no other questions, comes to this. Okay. Now, we all know that in the words of Donald Trump, who won by 304 electoral votes, which was the biggest ever, which it wasn't, Biden has 306, which is 2 more. So that makes him even more of a landslide, bigger than ever happened before, which of course is not true. There's been much bigger majorities. Look at Nixon. Nixon's first win is huge. I think McGovern to one state. Other than that, it was enormous.
For re-election also was larger. Trump's first also, but like you said, the more important issue that Biden has won even more than Trump both this time and in 2016.
And by the way, he's ahead by 6 million votes. When Trump won, he was down by 3 million. Biden's ahead by 6 million. So if we want to use Donald Trump as a thermometer of things, Biden has a landslide victory, okay? But this is the problem, and I call it the chaos scenario, okay? This is the Constitution. This is what it says. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislator thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. And I told you that. The way that has been interpreted constantly for 100 plus years is that they pick the slate for the Republicans and they pick the slate for the Democrats, and whoever wins, that slate then goes to vote the number of electoral votes. What he is saying, Trump, and Rudy Giuliani, whatever, when he's somewhat coherent, says that the states can ignore the vote because the language says that the state can pick the electors, which was meant in Supreme Court cases, in law. There's no question this has been handled and decided. They can pick the names, but they can't change the election. The Democrats win, they get the votes. The Republicans win, they get the vote. But they're saying the state legislature in its power to appoint electors can ignore the vote and pick Trump electors, even if Biden won their state. So say you have a legislator like Pennsylvania, which I believe is Republican. Even though Trump lost convincingly in PA, I think it's up to 75,000 votes now. It's a large number. Trump is saying that the legislator can get together and say, no, we're sending the Republicans. We don't care about the vote. That's what he's saying. That's illegal. That is absolutely illegal. The law is very clear that the state must pick the electors, but they must vote to reflect the election. It has to be, you can't change it. We have votes. The legislators just pick names, not how they vote. Here's the problem. Tim and I are both lawyers, and we were raised in law school, and we're a little older than some of our students. I'm a little older than Tim, but we were raised on the thought that the law meant something, that there was authority in the law. What happens if nobody cares? What happens if this goes through the federal courts and the courts are striking down every single one of his nonsense claims? But what happens if Pennsylvania legislature does this and it makes its way to the Supreme Court? and the Supreme Court says, we don't care what the law is. We want Trump as president. What happens then? Then what? And I don't have an answer for that. I can tell you one thing I saw in history, going back to Gore versus Bush. When the Supreme Court decided what happened in Florida, which set the election and elected George W. Bush over Gore, that was a corrupt legal decision. Any honest lawyer will tell you that their reading of the 14th Amendment in that case is how they decided was so beyond innovative, so against previous law, so against stare decisis, which is previous law, that it's an affront to anyone who's a legal scholar. But it happened. And what did we do? Nothing. We did nothing. So the question I pose, and I have no answer, is then what? This is a possibility. And that's how I end my lecture.
It is absolutely a possibility, and thank you for sharing that, Evan. What I'll add to that is if judges were the independent arbiters of law that they are purported to be, it would matter very little who appoints them. But every election cycle, there's this hand-wringing about who gets to pick Supreme Court justices and things like that, in part because we understand that presidents often are selecting judges who share their worldview and theory of law, or in the case of President Trump, are psychopaths. And I don't say that lightly, just in that in President Trump's administration, in partnership with Mitch McConnell and the Republican-led Senate, they have packed the federal judiciary in unprecedented ways. President Obama, I believe, appointed 121 federal judges and including two Supreme Court judges in 8 years. President Trump has done more than that in 4, in part because these Republican-led Senate had blocked many potential President Obama appointees. Most famously was Merrick Garland, and now have put 3 Supreme Court justices on the bench and have put dozens of federal judges on the bench, some of whom have never tried a case to verdict, some who have never led a deposition, some who are admittedly unfamiliar with the federal rules of civil procedure or the federal rules of criminal procedure. And these are people with lifelong appointments, and the only way that they can be removed is by death, retirement, or impeachment. And so people might think that someone like Professor Laine is being hyperbolic when he says that this is a possibility. This is absolutely a possibility right now. And President Trump, his administration, and his supporters have basically said the quiet part out loud, and we shouldn't dismiss it just because there is some incompetence in how they're effectuating their strategy. This is something that they're pushing towards, and the fact that every day they're getting more support from state, local, and federal elected officials should be something that alarms us. Professor Laine is exactly right. The Supreme Court picked the outcome of the presidential election in 2000. And at least 2 of the Supreme Court justices were appointed by the father of one of the candidates. The state that was in question was governed by the brother of one of the candidates. If this were the type of thing that happened in another country, we would have decried it as improper interference and would have said that this is a banana republic and that there are all other types of corruption. But when it happens in the United States, we don't use that colorful language. We just say, oh, get over it and move on. But there is an active attempt to subvert the will of the people. There's a system in place that suppresses the rights and liberties of people. And it should not surprise us. America has not been a true democracy it has not been a true democracy since 1965. It's 1964 with the enactment of the Voting Rights Act. And so that's a fraction of the history of America's lifespan. And so we are looking at the chaos scenario unfold before us. As I often tell my students, I'm sure people are tired of hearing the word unprecedented, but we are truly living in unprecedented times. And so with that, Professor Laine, I did want to thank you for this very informative and insightful presentation. You very clearly walked through why we have the Electoral College, how it works, how it disenfranchises people and dilutes votes from certain places, and even what the potential end game is. Few of us know how this, none of us know how this will ultimately unfold, but it's certainly worth our attention and worth watching. With that said, we did have a little bit of time, and so if there are any of those who are joining us who have additional questions while we have Professor Laine here, we would welcome the opportunity to hear from you.
I want to add just one thing, Tim. When you said get over it, those are the famous words of Judge Scalia, who wrote the opinion
Absolutely.
in Gore versus Bush, which again was a corruption of the law, of anyone who studied constitutional law, how they came down on it. It was appalling. And when he was approached by a number of legal scholars afterwards, for the many years before he died, that was his word. He says, get over it. Get over it. I just find that amazing, that thought process.
It is, especially coming from the side that tells people that we need to honor their feelings and coddle their elected officials and allow them to process of having lost an election. Like you said, the people have spoken in unprecedented ways. We have the largest amount of people who have ever voted in a presidential election in U.S. history. President-elect Biden, because he is president-elect, I'm going to say that. He has received more votes for president than any person in U.S. history. He's leading the popular vote by almost 6 million votes. He has what is unequivocally a landslide in the Electoral College. He has a larger percentage of the vote. Any conceivable metric that you would want to consider for how we could or should select a president, he has won that. So now it's just a matter of, will we honor the system that we say is in place? And like you said, there's no way of knowing. And I kind of go back to just the selection of some of these federal judges. I mean, I have more legal experience than the most recent Supreme Court justice appointee. And I have almost as much teaching experience as she does too. And so to think, and I don't believe I should be a Supreme Court justice with my level of legal experience or teaching experience. But here she is sitting atop the nation's highest court. And for as long as she lives or until she chooses to do something else. And to hear some of these other nominees and Judiciary Committee hearings saying, I've never tried a case to verdict, is astounding to me, that you think that you should be a judge. And so the fact that these types of things have happened in front of us and that these are the people who could be determining the outcome of this election should concern us. And so I thank you again for just bringing this to our attention. I think this is an extremely important topic, especially considering that there's still active litigation. Like you said, the president has, I think he's 1 for 25 right now in terms of lawsuits right now. And even some of, at least one thing I think to take solace in is some of the cases have gone before federal benches where he has appointed judges, and even they have said that there is no so there's nothing that can substantiate allegations of fraud to the level that would change the outcome of the election. So that is heartening, but who knows what will happen aside from that.
Well, I'll end with one thing from Hamilton, the play, not the man. History has its eyes on us. And what happens up through January 20th will be the kind of thing they're going to read about 100 years from today, on how America withstood a challenge or how America failed. That's how serious this is. So thank you everyone for listening. Thank you for having me. Tim, thank you for inviting me, and thank you to the organization. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you again, Professor Laine. We appreciate you taking time on a Thursday night to share with us. We thank you for all who have watched this either via the Facebook live stream or who have joined us on Zoom. Again, it's a Thursday night and you all are up with us talking about the Electoral College. So we appreciate you joining us and being informed by our esteemed guest on this evening. We look forward to sharing other insights and information with you as well. Keep your eyes on this and we will be in touch with you as well. With that said, Jacob, if you're still on, if you wanted to have any closing remarks, I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, hold on. Yes. Can you hear me? So thank you to everyone who tuned in to listen to another program, webinar by CARE Philadelphia, Council on American Islamic Relations. Our role here is to bring, at times, uncomfortable truths to the population so that it could rise up in defense of democracy, not to rise up against democracy. So thank you, Tim. Thank you, Evan, for a most enlightening program.
Thank you again. It was a pleasure, Evan. We appreciate you joining us tonight.